Okay, so like Don said, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon to talk about spooky things. A little bit about myself. So I got my doctorate in creep from the University of North Texas. Just kidding, it was in Gothic literature. And I've just always been attracted to kind of dark, creepy, spooky things. That's kind of my forte. And I'm also a Latinx woman. And so as I was preparing for this presentation, a lot of things fell into place for me when it comes to kind of trauma and an attraction to the spooky thing, the spookier side of life. So my mother is Panamanian and my dad is white. And growing up, I didn't have a lot of the same cultural experiences as my peers. So if any of you are Hispanic or Latinx in the comments, let me know if this resonates with your experience. So the fact that I didn't have that growing up kind of more Latinx, growing up more passing for white, it did give me several advantages and a great deal of privilege. And I think that's what my mother intended, because she didn't want me to struggle like she had, because my mother is very dark skinned. And so, in one sense it worked because I passed for white and I don't have to deal with a lot of the same things that my darker skinned brothers and sisters have to deal with. But it also led to kind of a crisis of culture and cultural identity because I didn't feel like a real Latinx person. So people would tell me about, like not knowing what's in a country crock spread container or in the butter cookie container or la chancla. And I really didn't know what they were talking about. Thankfully, my husband is Hispanic and his family hails from Mexico. And I feel like that really helped me, and I was able to kind of adopt a lot of like the cultural practices, and I felt like my identity became more complete, because it didn't matter that my upbringing was different. Like I was still Latinx and that was still valid. So I'll keep on kind of touching on that kind of as we go through the presentation. So before we start, I kind of want to define terms. I'm a teacher, so this is what I enjoy doing. So when it comes to Latino or Latinx versus Hispanic, Latino / Latina Latinx, it means that you're coming from Latin America. So you're coming from a certain country. And that, and I have here on this Venn diagram that includes countries like Brazil, French Guyana, Guadeloupe, Haiti, Martinique, and St. Martin. So those are Latino countries. It does not include Spain. So Hispanic countries, that refers to a country that speaks Spanish. So it includes Spain, but it doesn't include places like Brazil or French Guyana or Haiti. But there are a lot of countries that kind of fall into both of these categories, like Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, stuff like that. So this is just kind of give you an idea of what those two terms mean, and to give you an idea of the cultural diversity that I'm talking about. So today when I'm talking about Latinx culture, it's not one monolithic thing. It's a lot of different countries and a lot of different cultures that I'm talking about today. So why use the term Latinx? So this is a more recent term that has evolved in the past couple of years, so when we talk about someone who's Latino or Latina, it's always either masculine or feminine, because as a Latinate language, Spanish, everything's masculine or feminine. It's like la pluma, or you know what I mean? So it's like everything has a gender, and by saying Latinx instead of Latino or Latina, it acknowledges that the gender neutral and the non-binary members of this ethnic community. So, all right. So now that we've gone through our, language lesson, I'm going to give you a little bit of a history lesson. So today we're going to talk about, like I said, the kind of spooky side of Latinx culture and how that is connected to the trauma of colonialism. So there are really two waves of colonialism that occur. The first wave happens in the 15th century. So this is when Britain, Spain, France, and Portugal start to colonize North and South America. So I've got a timeline here. I love a timeline. I love putting things in context. So here we have in 1492, Columbus discovers the Caribbean islands. And then after that, in 1507, you have the New World is named after Americus Vespucius. And then in 1512, you've got Balboa exploring the Pacific Ocean. And then in 1520, Montezuma is killed by the conquistador Hernan Cortez in the takeover of Tenochtitlan. And then finally, and I'll skip over 1533, but in 1584, Sir Walter Raleigh sends the first British expedition to America. So this kind of period in history gets framed as one of European expansion and exploration, but that was not the case for indigenous people, and the story is not good for them on their side. The motivation behind this first wave of colonialism was God, gold, and glory, your 3 Gs. So one, it was about spreading Christianity to quote unquote heathen peoples. It was about treasure, bringing treasure back to the mainland. And it was also about glory. So European nations would compete with each other, and their glory kind of would be dependent on how many colonies that they had. So like I said, this period is presented as one of European discovery, but, you know, these places weren't newly discovered. There were people who had been living there for centuries. And also this world was not new. Despite people calling it the New World, it was not new. People were living there for centuries beforehand, but apparently a place has not really been discovered if it hasn't been discovered by a white person. So to kind of talk a little bit about Columbus, or I want to talk about this era in terms of how it was devastating, really, to the indigenous people whose lands were discovered by European colonizers. So one example is Columbus. He became the viceroy and governor of the Caribbean islands, and he committed, you know, horrible atrocities against the native people there that led to the decimation of their population. And there are things in the United States, like, or before it was known as the United States, but in North America, like epidemics, diseases like smallpox, really, they wiped out entire tribes because these native peoples did not have the same kind of immunity to European diseases. Also through exploitation. So Spanish conquistadors, they developed a economía, which was a system that was set up to protect people from warring tribes. And it was meant to teach them the Spanish language and introduce them to Catholicism and kind of assimilate them into kind of like European culture. But it really became tantamount to slavery and serfdom. There's massacres, there's warfare. And I found an interesting fact that European colonization of the Americas during this time resulted in the deaths of so many people that it led to climatic change and temporary global cooling. So think about that for a minute. So many people died that it actually had an effect on climate change. So that is the kind of scope of death and devastation that we're talking about here when we talk about this first wave of colonialism. All right, some more history. So the second wave of colonialism happens in the 19th century. So I'm going to talk about the US, and then I'm going to talk about Europe in a broader context. So in 1830, President Andrew Jackson signs the Indian Removal Act, which leads to the forced relocation of Native American tribes along the Trail of Tears. Once he clears out the Native American peoples, that makes a way for pioneers in the 1840s to travel west on the Oregon Trail. After that, Manifest Destiny was a really big thing in 1845. This idea is used to argue for the annexation of Texas. And Manifest Destiny was this belief that US settlers were destined to expand across North America. And they were meant to spread the virtues of Christianity, and their mission was to remake the Western, wild, untamed United States in the image of the agrarian East, and that it was this irresistible duty that they had to fulfill. In 1846, you have the Mexican-American War that begins. So after Texas is annexed, Mexico and the United States fight over where the boundary line is between the US and Mexico. So Mexico says it's the Nueces River, and then the United States says, no, it's the Rio Grande River. And we all know how that turned out. So this is happening in the United States. Let's kind of fast forward towards the end of the 1800s, and we have the scramble for Africa. So this is right before this, the Suez Canal is constructed, and that really opens up the continent of Africa to European powers. And so they, Britain, France, Portugal, Spain, they basically came in and they cut up Africa like it was a pie, and they took large swaths of lands for themselves. They really this led to a lot of problems, because they really, disregarded tribal alliances and tribal, boundaries. And so now that's creating problems, because you have people who are being ruled by a colonial ruler, and they might necessarily be part of the same tribe. So in that sense, it was really devastating. And it was just arbitrarily. And I also have on here the, after Britain acquires large parts of Africa, the Berlin Conference, that's when they really divided up parts of Africa equally between the European nations. And an example of that is King Leopold II of Belgium, who the Berlin Conference actually approved of him, claiming what he called the Congo Free State. But he is actually known to history as the Butcher of the Congo, and there are well-documented acts of brutality towards the Congolese people, and it resulted in 10 million deaths. So this is a lot, all right? So there's a lot of trauma that is involved with Latinx culture and the Latinx identity. And this isn't even to talk about systemic racism and kind of the prejudice and discrimination that Latinx people face today. So let's talk about how does Latinx culture deal with trauma? And like I said, Latinx people are not a monolith. Latinx and Hispanic people deal with trauma in many different ways. But as I see it, Latinx people were killed, their culture was erased, and then the pain of that was denied by colonizers who were responsible. So when it comes to trauma, we're not too great at dealing with it. You either repress it, pretend that it didn't happen, or just don't talk about it, right? And so this leads me to kind of talk about mental health and mental illness in the Latinx community. So only 20% of Latinx people experiencing mental health issues ever speak to their doctors about their symptoms. And research has shown that in the Latinx Hispanic population, older adults and youth are much more susceptible to mental distress related to immigration and acculturation. There are some barriers that are working against Latinx people here when it comes to trauma. Religion can be a factor. There is this belief in Latinx culture that faith and prayer can help with mental illness, or that, if you're having a problem, if you're feeling depressed, you should just pray about it and put your faith in God. And then there's this stigma against mental illness and treatment. And so there's this idea that your mental illness could be due to demons, lack of faith, or sinful behavior. So it's kind of, it's not really encouraged for you to go get help and talk to a professional about your mental health. Also, there's the idea in the family that if you discuss problems with mental health, that can create embarrassment and shame for the family. And because family is such a huge part of Latinx culture and values, you don't want to endanger that. So that's just another barrier. Also, gender roles play a part. There's this idea of machismo, that men are not supposed to feel pain. They are not supposed to be vulnerable. They're supposed to be tough. And so toxic masculinity comes into play. The same is on the other side it's also true for women, because Hispanic and Latinx women are expected to put their families above themselves and to just continue to be strong and not to become vulnerable and seek help for mental health issues. When it comes to actual treatment for these mental health issues, poor communication is an issue. There aren't enough people who speak both languages, so there might not be a provider who's bilingual or an interpreter. And because of this, Latinx and Hispanic people are more frequently undertreated than their white counterparts. And then also there's the idea of access to insurance. Like I believe 18% of Latinx Hispanic people in the US do not have health insurance, so they're far less likely to go seek treatment for a mental health disorder. So like I said before, you know, how do we deal with this trauma? If we don't talk about it, we repress it, right? Repression is a really big thing in our culture, and that leads me to the statement that the first principle of horror is the return of the repressed. And this is an idea that I've developed through my studies in the Gothic and through horror, is that in order to have horror, in order to have terror, you have to have a return of something that is repressed. So Latinx culture as a whole, they are bearing the brunt of centuries of colonization and abuse, and they are to some degree repressing that, and so it kind of comes out in a myriad of ways, and it comes out in the form of really monsters. And so I want to talk about that a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and play this. We're going to talk about Guillermo del Toro. So he's a Mexican film. I'm sure you guys are familiar with him. You've probably seen Pan's Labyrinth or The Shape of Water. So he's a Mexican filmmaker. And he has a series of films, The Devil's Backbone, and he also has Pan's Labyrinth, which are supposed to be part of a trilogy about the Spanish Civil War that happened between 1936 and 1939. So I'm going to just show you the trailer for The Devil's Backbone, and then we'll have a bit of discussion in the chat. We have that, like in the beginning of the trailer, you saw that giant kind of ordnance or missile. It falls into the courtyard of the orphanage, and it kind of just stays there. It doesn't explode, but it does really represent this kind of ticking time bomb. And it also represents that this place is kind of caught up and captured in a moment. So I do a lot of research about trauma, and the thing about trauma is when it occurs, it can be so soul-shattering that it becomes this moment outside of time, like we cannot process it. So as a result of that, it becomes kind of suspended in time, and then it repeats over and over again. And so that's what's really happening in this film with Guillermo del Toro, is he's exploring this idea of trauma, of a ghost as a moment trapped in time, like an insect trapped in amber. And he really speaks to this visually in his film by having the character of Santi always appear like he's suspended in water. Okay, so this is something he's exploring, and it's the trauma not just of these children, but it's the trauma of a nation. And so you can see here how he's using the ghost story to kind of explore that. So I want to look at your comments really quick. So I feel like this is a theme in most of the movies he produces, like El Orfanato, Mama. Yeah. Eric Cuellar says, I need to put that on my watch list. Definitely worth it. And then Carlos says, added to the soon watch list. And then Alejandra says, the idea of being an orphan is already really traumatic. Yeah, it is really traumatic, but it is about the children that are kind of suspended in a moment in time because they don't know what's happened to their parents and they don't know what's going to happen to them. So I'm going to talk next about Pan's Labyrinth. And what I want you to do in the chat while I'm playing this clip is I want you to kind of respond to what you're seeing and think about what those elements might mean. And then we'll kind of discuss after. So this is kind of looking at it from the perspective of trauma and from the perspective of Latinx trauma, I want to kind of see what you're seeing. So please respond in the chat, and then we'll take a look after. So let me go ahead and play it. I want to kind of look at a couple elements in this, but at first I want to respond or kind of sum up your comments in the chat. So talking about the white figure being a metaphor, the amount of food on the table is taunting. Melissa kind of hits on mythology, the pomegranates in the underworld. And kind of respond to this in the chat. How many grapes did she eat? Did anybody notice how many grapes that she ate? At least 2, just 1? Nope, it's definitely 2, yeah. And how many fairies die? Eric says never counted. Yeah, so it's kind of like it's showing that for every action there is a consequence. So she has chosen to transgress and to go against the rules that would allow her to go into this kind of scary underworld and come back. And so even though like her breaking the rules doesn't affect her, there are consequences for breaking the rules. And it's kind of like referencing mythology with Persephone, who, you know, she eats pomegranate seeds while she's captured in the underworld, and so she has to stay down there for as many seeds as she's eaten. So there is kind of this juxtaposition of the two elements, right? So let's kind of talk about the white man. I think a lot of you guys were kind of hitting on his appearance. So you're talking about like, why the eyes and the hands? I think somebody says, what I see, I take. Stephanie says the eyes on the palms often symbolize protection, which is ironic because the food in the hands is someone, it's supposed to be someone you can trust, but you actually can't in this instance. I also wanted to point out, so obviously this monster devours children, but we have the pile of shoes in the corner, which actually evokes the Holocaust, right? And the kind of lost generation that was lost to the Holocaust. So yeah, it's also a warning to the children, like La Lechuza and La Llorona. She's learning a lesson, right, from transgressing. So this is just like the Devil's Backbone kind of dealt with the trauma of war through the lens of a ghost story. What Guillermo del Toro is doing here is he's kind of trying to deal with the trauma of war through a fairy tale. Another thing I definitely wanted to point out is the juxtaposition that Guillermo del Toro makes between the pale man's table and the table of Captain Vidal, right? Who is basically the villain of the piece. He's an officer, and he, as part of the fascist regime that he's under, he enforces rationing. And so you get this juxtaposition of images of the two tables, right? The table that is set with a bounty, but there's nobody to enjoy it, right? And so there is a thing of like hoarding food or controlling resources, right? That Guillermo is kind of commenting on in terms of fascism. So yeah, I think you guys are all kind of hitting on the right things. I think that the pale man can kind of represent the tyranny of fascism. Even though he has a huge table full of food, he looks emaciated. He folds his skin hanging, he looks hungry. So it's kind of this specter of fascism and tyranny that is never satisfied no matter how much it has, right? So you guys are really hitting it on the head today. So this leads me to talk about Latinx monsters and their relationship to the kind of cultural trauma of colonialism. That's not to say that every Latinx monster is connected to colonialism. There are plenty of monsters who aren't. You know, I'm not going to say that Chupacabra is about colonialism. You might be able to make that argument, but I'm not going to make it here. So I'm just going to talk about a couple that caught my eye. So who was talking about Nancy? So Nancy was talking about Lechuza and La Llorona. So we're going to talk about La Llorona. So this is a very prominent monster in Latinx culture. So this lovely carving is in Coahuila. And so this legend of La Llorona is told throughout Latin America. And the way the story goes is that she was a woman who had children with a man that she loved. She's a dutiful wife and mother. And then her husband decides that he wants to leave her for another woman, and devastated by that betrayal and, in a rage, she drowns her children. She immediately regrets drowning her children, but she can't undo what has been done. And so she drowns herself in despair. And if you have a different version of the La Llorona story, go ahead and put it in the chat, because it kind of varies from country to country. So even though she drowns herself in despair in the hopes that she can join her children in the afterlife, she cannot join them in the afterlife because she can't find them. And so because of that, she goes after wandering children. So this was a thing that I've heard, especially from my husband, that was used where it's like, you better go to bed or La Llorona is going to come and get you. Or you better eat your vegetables or La Llorona is going to come and get you. So it is this kind of thing that's used to kind of keep kids in line. But we can also see this monster as being tied to the trauma of colonialism, because it is conflated sometimes with the tale of La Malinche, she was a native woman who was given to Hernan Cortez as a slave. And she gave birth to his first son, Martin, who is considered one of the first mestizo peoples, that mixture of European and indigenous ancestry. And in Mexico, she's considered both the mother of the Mexican people, but also she's considered a traitor for aiding the Spanish colonization, because she served as an interpreter, advisor, and an intermediary for the Spanish and for Cortez. So I'm going to look at a couple of other versions of the story that you've heard. So Pedro says the one that he heard is that La Llorona threw her baby to the river. She regretted immediately, and therefore people listened to her mourn, looking for her lost baby. Alejandra says in Costa Rica, she had a baby out of wedlock. She drowned the baby. So once again, we have that kind of societal transgression of an unmarried mother. Melissa says, near San Antonio, there's Woman Hollering Creek. Not sure how it's related to this, though. I would love to see that. But what I kind of want to point out with this monster specifically is the generative power of women, the fact that they can give birth and that create life, but also the destructive power, and how they're kind of two sides of the same coin. And I think by conflating it with the story of La Malinche, it's kind of like, yes, you are the mother of Mexican people, but at the same time, enabling colonialism and bringing so much trauma and so much bloodshed as a result. So bringing these children into the world and giving them life, but also destroying them in some sense. So, yeah, awesome. And I like this quote from Ordinary Girls, where the author talks about, the scariest part was not that La Llorona was a monster, that she came when you called her name 3 times in the dark, or that she could come into your room at night and take you from your bed like she'd done with her own babies. It was that once she'd been a person, a woman, a mother, and then in a moment, an instant, a split second later, she was a monster. So I see this story really as an example of how trauma can kind of turn you into a monster, and how we look to monsters, or how trauma creates monsters in a culture, really. So, and the next monster I'm going to look at, I only have 2, is Pishtaco. And I wonder if anybody knows about this, because I didn't know about him until a couple days ago. But this is really, this is a monster that comes from Peru and Bolivia. And the earliest account of this legend is from 1574. So the Pishtaco is a pale-skinned vampire boogeyman who roams the Andes and kills peasants in order to drain them of their body fat. So in the Andes, Eric says, fish tacos. No, Eric, fish tacos. So, but back to what I was saying, sorry. So fat has been highly prized in the Andes region for centuries, which makes a lot of sense when you think about how high up they are, and the weather changes that can be quite drastic. And so this idea of this valuing of fat, they even had a deity for fat. And it's also natural for, rurally poor peasants to see fleshiness and an excess of body fat as something that is a very good sign of life and good health. So this legend of the pistaco is taken directly from the horrors that were inflicted on the indigenous communities in Peru and Bolivia during the 15th century, during that first wave of colonialism. So the conquistadors had a practice of treating their wounds with their enemy's corpse fat. That really horrified the native people. And Spaniards are also said to have killed Indians and boiled their corpses to produce fat to grease their metal muskets and cannons, which rusted quickly in the humid Amazon. So because of that, there started this strong association between colonizers and fat, and kind of like the pistaco was born. Andean native peoples feared Spanish missionaries as that they were pistacos, believing that they were killing people for their fat, and that they were using that fat to oil the church bells in order to have them make a more sonorous noise. And so if you look at the pistaco as a metaphor, it really is about how colonizers came and really kind of sucked the richness out of these native peoples for their own benefit. So as a result, the pistaco is always portrayed as a white male invader. So they can be depicted as priests, doctors, aid workers, tourists, anthropologists. And as a result, in Peru, there's been the rejection of programs like the U.S. Food for Peace programs by several communities, because there's this fear that they're going to come in, they're going to fatten up the children, and they're going to exploit them for their fat. Natives have attacked geologists working in Peru and Bolivia, believing they were pistacos, and the work of anthropologists has been stymied because there was this belief that the measurements of fatfuls were rumored to be part of a plot to select the fattest individuals. So the quote we have here is from Nina Zumel, which is that this pistaco might be the stranger next to you on the bus. Don't fall asleep. As you sleep, he would extract the brown, hard fat around your organs with his knife. You awaken feeling weak, you fall sick in a few days, and you die. And so kind of as a metaphor for the devastation of colonialism on the Peruvian people. So I want to take a pause and look at your comments, because I think you guys are really hitting it today. So Carmen says she heard of pistaco before. Kara said, I know it because of Supernatural. Yeah, they did do an episode, but in that episode, the pistacos were Latinx. So that kind of like undercut the whole thing of the pistaco being a white outsider that's coming to suck the fat and the health and vitality of Latinx people. Carmen says, holy crap, I never knew that. Yes, it is absolutely brutal and disgusting. Yeah, using the fat to oil swords and bells. And it really is kind of just a physical or a embodiment of what colonialism is, which is kind of taking the wealth, and both the cultural wealth and the material wealth of these indigenous civilizations and kind of sucking them dry. So, yeah. Awesome. All right, so let's continue on. So I'm going to close this out by talking a little bit about Dia de los Muertos. And so you can definitely respond to this in the chat. So when it comes to trauma, and it comes to like the large scale trauma that we're talking about with the first and second waves of colonialism, that definitely affects how Latinx cultures relate to death. I think when you have such a large scale of death, it can really affect how you relate to the dead and the afterlife. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Day of the Dead, when it's celebrated, and the cultures and traditions associated with it. So October 31st is All Hallows Eve, and that's when you make a children's altar to invite the angelitos, which are the spirits of the dead children, to visit. And then November 1st is All Saints Day, and that's when the adult spirits will come to visit. And then finally, November 2nd is All Souls Day, when families go to the cemetery to decorate the graves of their loved ones. And it's a 3-day fiesta that's filled with, decorating tombs with marigolds, pan de muertos, sugar skulls, skeletons, tissue paper, and other kinds of foods. So I'll talk a little bit about each of these things. So an ofrenda. So the purpose of the ofrenda is to honor the person who has passed. And so you do this by setting up an altar with their picture. You will put foods that they enjoyed in life. So this person was a big fan of bananas. And here's an example of pan de muerto. So pan de muerto kind of looks like regular bread, but the way they've shaped the tops here is it looks like little bones on top of it. So you are encouraged to kind of make the ofrenda, you add things to it that'll make the dead feel at home, things that they liked. So things, you might make their favorite food, or you might put their favorite pair of shoes, or you might put things from their favorite TV show. And it's just meant to kind of make it very enticing to that person so that they will come and visit their altars. There will be lit candles, sugar skulls, marigolds are the flower of Dia de los Muertos, and that is meant to, because they're so bright, it's meant to attract the dead and to kind of lead them to the ofrenda. And so it's interesting because being a, like I said, with my experience with my Latinx culture, and I went to school in the Rio Grande Valley, which is where I met my husband. I had a teacher who had passed quite suddenly from heart complications, and it was really terrible. Like it happened really suddenly. I wasn't in his class or anything, but I remember him being one of the best teachers I ever had, really. And he passed in September, and I had the opportunity in October to do an ofrenda for him, and it was really therapeutic, and it really helped me because I just missed him so much, and I didn't have time. I'm sorry, I'm crying, but I didn't really. It was hard to process his death. And so the act of doing the ofrenda, putting pictures of him, putting his favorite books, he always loved animals, so putting stuffed animals on the altar was really helpful. And that's kind of how the ofrenda functions during Dia de los Muertos. So that's just kind of my experience with it. This is something that me and my husband, was not my husband at the time, he was just my boyfriend, did for our museum, and it was Cena de los Muertos. So what we did is we created mannequins of famous dead Latinx and Hispanic people. So we had Selena, we had Frida Kahlo, and all kinds of other people. And so this was kind of part of that celebration. So I just kind of wanted to share that. And then also what's really common with Dia de los Muertos is the calaveras. And so here we have the calavera Catrina, which was kind of, it was meant to poke fun at rich people and the refinedness of rich people. So this is what we have here. And as you can see, I've added this picture of Jack Skellington from Nightmare Before Christmas to kind of show how there's a natural equivalence, right? And so there's a reason why when Latinx people maybe see Nightmare Before Christmas, there's an automatic like, okay, this is familiar to me. So I wanna go ahead and look at your comments again. So Ariana says, like in the movie Coco, that was a really good movie. That movie definitely made me cry. Lisa says, yes, it's very therapeutic. It's beautiful to remember someone you love. And then, Eric does say, does anybody else feel like Dia de los Muertos is being taken from our culture? I think that there are some ways to appreciate it, you know, and there is definitely a line with cultural appropriation. Like now that we're coming up on Halloween, if Dia de los Muertos is not part of your culture, don't do a sugar skull costume, because a culture is not a costume and stuff like that. So that's definitely something to think on. I think you can appreciate, like for me, I was not raised with Dia de los Muertos. I'm not Mexican or Mexican American, but I definitely appreciate it and have made it part of my cultural practice because of my relationship with my husband, whose family comes from Mexico. So I think that there are ways to appreciate it and to practice it without appropriating it. I think the problem, the difference between appreciation and appropriation is when you take something and you kind of strip it of all of its cultural significance and you pass it off as your own, right? So I think there is a fine line to kind of dance there, but I think that's a really good point that you bring up, Eric. Yeah. Daniel says that he's from Costa Rica, and part of my Catholic family always negatively speaks about Dia de los Muertos, but I love the meaning of the day. And yeah, it's different in all kind of cultures. Like we were talking about earlier, Latinx culture is not a monolith. There are many different countries, many different cultures that are kind of a part of it. So yeah, I would say, Eric, I think, Isabel was responding to Eric talking about like the appropriation of Dia de los Muertos. I would say when you're looking for events to participate in, make sure that there are actual Latinx people who are involved in the organization of it. And I think that's a good indicator of how it's being approached and if it's appreciation versus appropriation. All right, guys. So I'm going to open it up to questions. So if you have any questions about this kind of thing, like I said at the top, I don't have all the answers, but I'll definitely point you in the right direction. You're definitely in the right place. You have me and you have Dawn, who's a librarian, so we definitely know how to use the catalog so we can find you an answer. So if you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat, and I will go ahead and look at your comments. Kara says, I appreciate the explanation of appreciation versus appropriation. Ooh, okay, Kristen says, Metaphor for Colonialism in Mexican Gothic by Moreno Garcia. So that's a book that you can read. Yeah. Awesome. Rick says, are there any book or article recommendations to expand on this? Dawn, do you want to speak to that? I think Dawn's already speaking to it in the comments. So we do have at the library here in Denton that you can look things up, and Denton Library is great because you can actually just pick up books. I know we're still living in COVID. You know, we're still living in very different times than we would normally, but you can go and get books picked up at the library. But yeah, Dawn, do you want to speak to that a little bit more?
Yeah. So were you referring to the article question or the book?
Either one.
Okay.
Yeah.
So really, I know not everyone lives in Denton, but your local library will always have places where you can obviously, or if you're in college, look up articles on subjects through EBSCO or something like that. I don't personally have any article recommendations. The Mexican Gothic one was interesting. I actually have that and read a little bit about that, or read a little bit of it. But yeah, something I did, I mean, there's so many great comments here. I'm not a part of the Latinx culture. And I was lucky enough several years ago to travel to Mexico to, I got to see some of the Day of the Dead rituals and Dia de los Muertos and all that, and see just, you know, what they do. But at the same time, it felt strange too, because it was almost like I was very respectful of obviously of everything, but I was just curious about like how people felt like, you know, you always see those little souvenirs of the different, you know, the skulls and the skeletons and the, you know, dresses with the hats and stuff. I don't know. Is that something that, I know it's a way to make money for the people that are there, but.
Yeah, I think that there's definitely, yeah, because I mean, I went to San Antonio and that's where I got these, you know, and I've been to, and these are like little, I don't know if you could see them, but these are like little sugar skull earrings. So there is a way you can kind of, I think that's what we were talking about before with the difference between appropriation and appreciation, is that there are definite ways you can appreciate a culture and kind of promote a culture without kind of taking it over. And especially if you're working with native artisans and people who are creating that kind of thing, go for it. I think that's really wonderful. And, you know, like I was saying, I wasn't raised with it either. It wasn't a thing in my house. We didn't have an ofrenda or anything like that. But after my professor passed and just knowing how much that had helped me, I really kind of adopted it as a cultural practice. So that's something you can also do if you're kind of maybe like me, a whitewashed Latina who's maybe struggling with your Latinness, you know, get in touch with your cultural roots and figure out what really resonates with you.
Good answer.
Cool. Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much for being here. This was really fun to present. October turned out to be a really busy month for me, but like I was telling Dawn before, I really like doing these presentations, and I always just feel very uplifted after. I love it interacting with you guys, especially during COVID. I'm just like, mostly I'm just talking to my dog or my husband, and that's it. So if you want more spooky content, you can follow me at Monster Scholar on Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter. And then here are my sources, because I'm a good researcher.
Yeah, I bet you would actually probably have some good recommendations, like if they had sources on there.
Exactly, yeah, on there. And if you want to put them in the chat, you can. And like Dawn said, I'm going to go ahead and edit this video, put it on my YouTube channel, and I'll send you all the links so you have access to it. But yeah, thank you so much for joining me, especially during this time. And thanks for stay spooky.